Hello and welcome to Everybody Has a Story with Jeff Seltzer. I am, as always, your host, Jeff Seltzer. Every week I interview someone about their interests, their life stories, whatever they've experienced. I'm trying to learn as much about people as possible, help them share their stories, and maybe share a few of my stories along the way as well. If you're new to the pod, so if it's the first time watching or listening to it, thank you so much for joining and thank you for giving it a shot. I think you'll have a fun time on this journey with me as well as with all of my guests. If you listen to this every week or watch it every week, thank you again for coming back. Really, really means a lot to me as I really, really appreciate as we're early in this journey, but I'm really enjoying this and it's been a lot of fun. Recently, one of my uncles, as well as one of Beth's uncles, reached out via text. Both of these are uncles of ours that don't really communicate that much to us, but it really meant a lot to hear from them. Hearing their feedback about the podcast, telling them that they love what they're hearing. So big shout out to both my uncle and Beth's uncle. So that was really, really sweet. So thank you so much. Before I introduce my guest this week, who's got a lot of fun stories that I'm really, really excited to share, wanted to do some housekeeping. So first of all, as always, on Instagram, you could find us at Everybody Has a Story Pod. If you want to be a future guest, or if you have any notes or comments or whatever, feel free to DM me as the DMs are open. Additionally, probably in a future pod, I'll probably do a Q&A. So if you have any questions about anything, myself, the podcast, whatever, anything in the background you're watching right now, shoot me a comment or a question. I'd love to be able to address it in a future podcast. If you want to watch this on YouTube going forward, you can check it out at Everybody Has a Story Pod. Additionally, on Spotify, you can watch it or listen to it. We're also on other podcast platforms such as Amazon, iHeartRadio, Apple, obviously, which is where most of my listens come from, and pretty much any platform. If there's a platform I'm missing that you want to see us at, shoot me a note. I'll definitely do what I can to add it. Additionally, my personal Insta is over at Seltzer77. You can email us directly at everybodyhasastorypod@gmail.com. Lastly, for all things Jeff Seltzer, as always, you can reach me at jeffseltzer.com. Got some really cool links in there, some really random videos and photos of all sorts of stuff throughout my life. So if you want a little bit more about me, it's there. Again, as always, my life's an open book, so feel free to reach out or shoot me a message. With that said, I would like to take this opportunity to welcome my guest for this week, Gary Taylor. Gary, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on, Jeff.
Awesome. Thanks for coming on. Can you give a real quick background on who is Gary Taylor?
Yeah, so I am somebody who created a YouTube channel and a website by the name of Coasting with Culture, which is all about combining theme park visits and riding roller coasters with various cultural experiences around the world. It was inspired by past journeys I've taken as a huge theme park and roller coaster fan, where I've had the opportunity to go to different parts of the world and visit all these different amusement parks. But I also, as somebody who had excellent social studies teachers back in high school and middle school, I really developed a fascination with history and with geography and things like that. And in some of the early travels with some group tours that went into other countries, we had the opportunity to add some experiences along with visiting different theme parks, such as a tour that I took with a group of folks into Mexico. We go to Six Flags Mexico and La Feria Chapultepec Magico. But before we really got into the amusement parks and the roller coasters, we went to see Ballet Folklorico. We had a chance to go and walk the pyramids of Teotihuacan and tried some fajitas at this little shack that was just amazing. And getting to have those additional experiences to go along with visiting theme parks and riding roller coasters, it all just kind of made sense to me when I decided to get into my own bit of content creation to do something that combine those together. And it also kind of helps it stand out a little bit more just because there's a lot of YouTubers out there who do theme parks and they do the vlogs where they give you the daily updates, whether a garbage can shifted 5 feet left or right, or they changed the menu price by 20 cents, and then you've got your other folks who do like rankings and things like that. And so I thought that this would be a way to kind of do something a little bit different.
Well, that's pretty awesome. Thank you for sharing, Gary, and I appreciate that. I'm also a fan of both Mexican food as well as amusement parks. So definitely a lot of passion for me out of this stuff. So you've done a lot of amusement park searching and I guess hanging out both in North America as well as worldwide. Before getting into any specific places you've gone to around the world, would you say there's any trends or any huge differences between what you would see in an amusement park in the United States versus anywhere else in the world?
Yeah, there's a few things that you'll notice when going to different parks. It in part stems from, the people going to the parks. Obviously, the kinds of things that they're into or their behaviors are also vastly different from what you might see back in the States, or their tolerance for lines, if you will. I still remember a time going to Japan to visit a park called Fuji-Q, which is right in the shadows of Mount Fuji. And when you go to that park, they are notorious for having horribly long lines. Every ride would be a minimum of 2 hours at times, or hour and a half, and sometimes it'd be even as high as three. But when you go there and you see all of the folks in line, the Japanese are notorious for being very patient, very oh shucks, what am I thinking of here? They're known for being a very orderly society. As you take escalators up and down, there's a place for you to stand and a place for you to walk. You always stay to one side or the other depending on what you're doing. And they definitely don't seem to mind waiting in long lines and keeping things nice and orderly in that fashion. Whereas, you go to other countries and sometimes you'll tend to see people cutting in line a lot more often. But there's also the differences in how parks are maintained and how they're presented. Sometimes we go to what we consider like mid-level parks, not your Disneys or your Universals, but you go to like a Six Flags and the level of theming there isn't quite at the same level as like a Universal or a Disney. But then you go to smaller parks that are about the same size as that in other countries. And sometimes their theming is out of the world. Like it's mind-boggling how detailed they can get with some of their storylines and some of the things that they do with their cues and how they make you feel like you're just in a whole different realm.
Yeah, it's a great call out. So similarly, I was in Japan about a month and a half ago. My family and I went to Tokyo Disney, and I would say something very similar. That like culturally, they were a very polite society. There wasn't a lot of line cutting. Also, wasn't very loud or kind of like over the top. Like when you go to Disney World in Florida or other places in the United States, you do get, I'd say, more, I want to say, obnoxious or over the top families or people. Versus in Japan, really didn't see that too much until, let's say, some of the Americans showed up eventually. It was definitely an interesting thing to see. And like, even like, to your point, waiting in lines, like most of the lines we waited on were anywhere between, I don't know, 15 minutes and an hour, give or take, whatever. But even the lines that were longer, like very orderly, no issues, everyone was kind of calm and fine, which I thought was great. What I saw, and I'm not sure about your experiences in Japan, whether you went to the Mount Fuji Park or other ones, from a technology perspective, I saw that the Tokyo Disney rides seemed to be like next level versus Disney World Florida. Like the visuals, the animatronics, things like that, it just felt a lot more real. And once I got over, the Japanese narration, for me, it was just very comfortable, and I really liked it. I really enjoyed the rides a lot more.
Yeah, I think there's a certain aspect with Tokyo Disney, probably because of the ownership structure,
Yep.
as it's actually 51%, 52%, like a slight majority of it's owned by an organization called the Oriental Land Company or something like that.
Right.
Whereas the other 49%, 48%, whatever the number is actually owned by Disney, and they have some sort of a licensing agreement. I might be off on that a little bit.
I think you're close to it. I heard something similar too, where like weirdly going into it, I was like, how is this not owned by Disney? But like they've got a little more freedom to do other stuff that maybe Disney in the United States wouldn't be able to do.
Yeah. And so I think there's probably that aspect of the influence from the Oriental Land Company that will play a role in just the amount of detail that goes into it. There's also times where with other Disney resorts, you notice a bit more of the quality differences. Like having worked at Disney World myself for about 3 years, you kind of understand how the sausage is made, for a lack of a better phrase.
Of course.
But you also see where things might get overlooked after so many days, where things do get a little bit more attention. But then you go to another Disney resort like a Tokyo or Hong Kong or even Disneyland, California, and you see that there are other things that there's a bit more attention given to. I always kind of got the sense that with Disney World, because they have so many people coming, and there's an aspect of it that a lot of folks who visit there, it's kind of a once in a lifetime or once every several years kind of a visit for a good number of the people that are there.
Yep.
they might let some things go a little bit longer than others. They might have more time between refurbishments or rethemes or things like that. Whereas the parks like Disneyland, where they would see a lot more repeat visitors,
Locals,
season
right?
pass holders, they tend to notice those details a lot more. And so they tend to keep it up a little bit better. And it very well could be a similar thing with the foreign parks, like Tokyo Disney, but that also could be something that's kind of tied to the Japanese culture, that they are that they really kind of take time to notice detail. Anytime you see a dish at a Japanese restaurant, it's not only meant to taste good, but it's also made to look good. They put a lot of effort into the presentation in the food. And so I would imagine that part of that carries over into the maintenance of the park.
I would think so. So you working in Disney World previously at one point, you said for about 3 years. Do you think part of the fact that they may let things go a little bit longer, because as you said, people take once in a lifetime or once every 3 to 5 year trips, like they're concerned that if people go for that once every 3 or 5 years, if they show up and Pirates of the Caribbean's closed for a long term or Jungle Cruise is closed for a long term, that people will be upset or disappointed that they missed that ride and they can't do it again for the 3 to 5 or 10 years.
Yeah, that seems like that could be a big part of it, because there's always that hesitancy to take out a ride that ends up being really popular, because there's people who are only going to get to be there that one time. And it could also be having to do with capacity, because
Of course.
these are parks that are visited by over 10 million people each, whereas with Magic Kingdom it's almost 20 million annually that walk through the gates of that place. And I've been there at days where they had 60 to 70,000 people in one day in the
Right.
park. And if you have 2 or 3 rides closed on that day, the other attractions will definitely feel it. And so I imagine that there's that aspect of it that goes into the consideration of when to do such operations.
Yep. So being that, as you said, you worked at Disney World, would you mind telling us a little bit more about what rides you worked on, or what actual jobs, or what you did there?
Yeah, so when I started at Disney World for the first, roughly year and 2 months, I started out at the Port Orleans Resort doing boat and bike rentals as a recreation host. And then after that, I went ahead and made the transfer to attractions at Magic Kingdom, as I felt that going into that area might have some better upward mobility than where I was at the time. And so at that point, I became a skipper of the Jungle Cruise. And that's actually where I met our mutual friend, Chelsea. And she eventually met her husband, Jay, as he
Right.
came in, I think either right before or right after I left and moved back to Washington State.
Got it.
And then after learning how to become a skipper of the Jungle Cruise, it was probably about 6, 7 months or so when I got cross-trained onto Pirates of the Caribbean, which was very fitting for me because I was a graduate from East Carolina University, and that's a school that has the mascot of the Pirates.
Oh, nice.
So there was kind of that personal connection that went with it. And also being in a town that was only 45 minutes to an hour away from the town of Bath, North Carolina, which was the longtime home of Edward Teach when he had a home in North America. And that's none other than Blackbeard.
Nice. So
And
what
then
sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, and then the last attraction that I worked on was the Hall of Presidents. And that was always a fun one because, again, that social studies aspect of my past, when I had these great teachers, especially my U.S. history teacher, a guy by the name of Will Weiberg. He absolutely had the deepest passion. And he was probably one of the more influential teachers of the social studies curriculum. And I'll never forget that he always talked about Theodore Roosevelt being this incredible president, and how he was one of those guys who could get into a fight and then just clean up and have a discussion right after. And, the way he shared these stories about him, it was one of those things where it became really infectious. And then having a chance to work on the Hall of Presidents, you're in this room where you get to see all of these artifacts from these past leaders, and then you get to see the actual show, and they have the animatronics with the different presidents, and you learn about the little nuances of things, such as how the Bill Clinton animatronic looks at his wrist at one point during the introduction of the presidents, because he donated one of his Casio watches
Oh, wow.
that he used to wear for running, because he thought it was so cool that each of the presidents since, I always probably get this wrong, but I think it was from Jimmy Carter on. So I think starting with Jimmy Carter, if not him, maybe Gerald Ford. But every president since at least Jimmy Carter, to my knowledge, the suit that they wear in the Hall of Presidents actually came from that president.
Wow, I didn't know that. It's crazy.
Yeah. And so Bill Clinton thought that was such a cool thing. He decided to add an extra donation, which was the form of the watch. And so as a little nod, every so often as they're presenting the other presidents, you see him look down, take a look at his wrist, and then looks back up.
That's really cool. So you've done a bunch of different rides and different attractions within Disney World. The one that I'm always most intrigued by is the Jungle Cruise, because a lot of the other ones, you're repetitively doing the same kind of a thing, or it's more of a safety thing. But being a Jungle Cruise skipper, you've got a lot of memorization to do, right? Talking about the backside of water, all the different, puns, which for me get me every time. Like I laugh every time that I see one of the Jungle Cruise skippers do it. How long did it take you to memorize that whole speech? And is there anything that you've done like on your own that you threw in there that wasn't scripted?
Oh man. So training at the Jungle Cruise when I was there was probably about a week and a half, somewhere in that time frame. It might have even been a little bit longer. I can't remember exactly off the top of my head how it was back when I had started.
Sure.
But as far as the memorization of the script, a lot of it's just repetition. With anything that has to do with memorization, you do it over and over. You start to pick up on visual cues. You learn some of the other joke options. As far as going off script, it was one of those things where you're really not supposed to, but some folks would kind of do it anyway.
Sure.
But I've since heard that that's been eased up a little bit. But whether or not that's actually still the case, I couldn't say, because it's been almost 9 years since I was there. But At the time that I was there, it was one of those things where if you said something that wasn't on the script and there was a complaint that was filed about it, then it was on you.
Got it. So you worked there, I think, per our previous conversation that we had offline, you also worked at Cedar Point in Sandusky, Ohio at one point. Is that correct? That
is correct. That was... I apologize for the ambulance that's passing by my apartment here.
No worries.
That was back in 2004 and 2005, which I started out working on a roller coaster that was there called Mantis, and then about a month later switched to another one called Iron Dragon. And then after that, I ended up spending the rest of that first summer and all of the next summer working on area that was called Peanuts Playground, which is now Planet Snoopy, based off of the Peanuts characters.
Nice.
And that was a combination of a playground area with a swinging ship ride called Ocean Motion, which is now in a different spot in the park, and another ride called Chaos, which is no longer there. Working at Cedar Point is a lot different than working at Disney, because obviously Cedar Point's more of your traditional amusement park. They aren't really gung-ho on the big-time theming or anything like that. And it was also a seasonal spot because of the way that Cedar Point operates from May until, at the time, October for their Halloween event. I think that's still predominantly the calendar. However, because I was in college at the time, I usually would depart right about the beginning of August, as we would have classes beginning in college around that time. And so I couldn't really stick around for the full season like some folks could.
Got it. That's awesome. I would imagine definitely a different experience. Disney's probably a bit more corporate, to your point. Just different experiences for the guest as well as for the employee. So after obviously working both those parks, you've done a lot of travel over the world, which you've documented on your website, coastingwithculture.com. So we talked about Japan a little bit before. What are some of your favorite places you've traveled around the world, and what are some of your favorite amusement parks you've gone to in those places?
It's so hard to pick just one, because you think of all these different locations and these things that really make them stand out. And sometimes it's the experiences that you have along the way in those locations. Japan obviously is one that's really high on my list. I absolutely loved my time there. And that was a trip that I think by the time I got to the end of it, as it was about a week and a half, maybe close to 2 weeks, it was one of those trips that I just wasn't ready to go home yet. I just wanted to experience more of it, because it was such a fascinating experience to be riding in these rail cars or these subways where you're shoulder to shoulder with what feels like hundreds of people in one car, but you could hear a pin drop because everybody just rides quietly and, minds themselves, not like, riding in subways here in the States. And, you have people having full-fledged conversations, or sometimes the occasional person who's got their cell phone music playing, even though there's often signage that says not to do that. But it was just a vastly different experience. But then you also have places like South Africa. I had a chance to go there in 2018, and it was an interesting time, in part because, South Africa is a little ways since apartheid, but it's not exactly completely off of their minds. It's still one of those things that there's still issues that they're haggling with since that period. But when talking with people about it, one of the things that always seemed to be a common theme with those that I spoke with was hope. You've got these folks who they acknowledge the difficulties that came through at that time and the violence that would occur, the challenges that came up with it. And yet everyone was hopeful that things are going to get better.
Right.
We've still got a ways to go, but it's going to improve. And that didn't matter if you were speaking with somebody who was multi-generational native of that part of Africa, if you were speaking with somebody who was of Afrikaans descent, the Dutch settlers who had come into South Africa in the 1800s, and they all were sharing that same sentiment from the conversations I had. And I thought that was incredibly refreshing to see, because, with something like that, you would expect that there'd probably still be some tensions, but they all had the more hopeful approach, or the more hopeful mindset to it. And then on top of that, South Africa is just an incredible place to visit, because you've got the beauty of Table Mountain there right outside of Cape Town, or Cape Town surrounds Table Mountain, and going up on top of that with the gondola and getting a chance to see the city below with the ocean coastline right there. It was just stunning to see. And then one of my more recent trips, which I'm still working on the vlogs for right now, was to Italy last year. And I just started doing some editing of the San Marino video, where we took a bit of time to go and visit this smaller landlocked country in the middle of Italy, San Marino. And before we got there, I really didn't know a whole lot about San Marino. Come to find out that it's basically a country that's on one of the mountains there, and their capital, the city of San Marino, is at the highest point of one of those mountains. And you go up there, and it's built around these towers that sit on the peaks of this mountain. And these towers, they literally look like something that would be out of a science fiction book or some kind of a fantasy novel, because it's like, if this is the edge of the cliff, then this is the tower on top of it right here. And it's like just a little bit further, it's going to go sliding down the cliff wall there. But somehow it managed to stay there, even though it was built back in the 1300s.
Wow.
And it's just stunningly beautiful.
That's crazy. So with all of your world travel, something I'm always curious about. So I left North America for the first time when I went to Japan back in June, July. And for me, it was a huge wake-up call. 14-hour flight, 13-hour time zone difference. So it was probably, we were there for a week and a half. I never fully adjusted. And then coming home, it was probably about a week before I was back to kind of like Eastern time. Like, what are your tips and tricks? Like, how do you, it sounds like you've been all over the world. Like, how do you time adjust? Like, do you force yourself? Do you kind of like try to time adjust before you leave? Like, what's your best practice?
It's always found, or I always found it, that it's a lot harder when going west. So when going over to Asia, such as with going to Japan or going to Singapore, it's always a lot harder to make that adjustment, because you're basically taking off in the middle of the afternoon, especially from here on the West Coast. All my flights to Asia had been 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock, maybe 1 o'clock. Whereas going over to Europe, it's usually in the evening. So you have all day to kind of wear yourself out and then try to get some sleep on the plane. And even with the time zone adjustment that way, you can kind of go about it. It's like, I just had a bad night's sleep and I just got to deal with it. So you get some caffeine, go through that first day and just kind of struggle. And then you crash hard that night, get a good night's sleep. The other direction, probably not the healthiest approach, but one thing that I did once, and this was for my Southeast Asia trip, as I had a 6 a.m. departure from Seattle to get down to San Diego for a connection that was going to go to Tokyo and then a connection from there to Singapore. I just stayed up all night the night
Oh,
before
wow.
the flight.
Just tire yourself out.
Yeah, I kind of figured, if I can make this work, I'll fall asleep on that Tokyo flight. And then when I wake up, yeah, it'll be kind of the afternoon, but it'll be that same situation. It just wasn't the best night's sleep. And then I'll wear myself out by the time I get to Singapore, because at that point it's going to be midnight and long day of travel. I'll just be ready to zonk out. And it kind of bit me because as I did that flight to San Diego,
Right.
I definitely did what one of my professors called the thirsty chicken, which is that stupid little bird thing that will tilt over and get a little bit of water and it keeps tilting. So he would refer to the students who were falling asleep in his class as the thirsty chicken, because they would just kind of
they keep waking up and popping up, right?
Yeah. And so I didn't have that issue as much on the flight to San Diego.
Right.
Actually, no, I did. I had it happen a couple of times on that flight to San Diego. I should take that back. And then the flight to Tokyo, which was the one I was going to try to sleep on, it just wasn't really happening that well for me. I was like, great. This is going to be rough. I'm going to fall asleep like in the middle of the day. And then I get on the flight to Singapore, which took off about 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon in Tokyo's time. And then as I'm on that flight, I end up falling asleep for like 3 hours. So then I'm like, yeah, this is really going to mess everything up. I'm going to be completely off for like the first 2-3 weeks. And then I get to the hotel. It was a little bit after midnight, probably about 1, 2 in the morning. And I put on a movie, watched it for a little bit, ended up dozing off in the middle of it. And then I woke up at like 8 o'clock in the morning, like, oh, this actually kind of worked. And then just went through the day kind of like I would approach going to Europe. And then by the time it was 6, 7 o'clock, maybe 8 o'clock in the evening, I was just ready to crash hardcore.
Do you usually have a travel buddy or usually fly solo? Because I'd imagine, if you're obviously exhausted, not sleeping well, and then kind of either waking up or showing up in a random place that you're not familiar with, it's got to be kind of overwhelming at points, right? Maybe. So do you have somebody that kind of like a side person or a friend or whatever that will travel with you and help you out, or are usually on your own and hoping for the best in these places?
Different trips. There's been, or I've taken different trips where I've been by myself, and the nice thing about going with yourself is that you kind of have the flexibility to decide how you want to go about your day. If you just need a day to crash and just not do anything, then you could just go ahead and do it. And the only person that's going to experience any repercussions is yourself.
Right.
You're not going to ruin anybody else's time or anything like that. But you miss out on having those shared experiences. You go to one of those places with those incredible sights, and if you're there by yourself, it's like, oh, I don't get to really talk to anybody about, wasn't that incredible?
But to that point, though, is that, you do a lot of documenting, a lot of, I guess, vlogging, a lot of videos and pictures. Like, I guess if you're traveling by yourself, to then utilize like that as an opportunity to kind of like document it, put it up on the web, and then have conversations with shared experiences with people who have done that before. Like, is that kind of what you get out of that?
Yeah, that ends up being a lot easier to do. That's another benefit of going on your own, is that when documenting these different experiences, when doing the videos or photos, it's a lot easier to have that extra time to really put those together or try out different angles. Like, oh, look at this. Oh, wait, what's it going to look like over there? Oh, Look at that. That looks great there. Ooh, what's it going to be like over there? Ooh, that looks great over there.
Yeah, you don't feel like you're putting somebody out by saying, hey, let's take an extra picture. As opposed to if you're with somebody, you're like, I don't want to waste their time. Let's move on because my picture's probably good enough, right?
Yeah. And then there's also the other situation, though, where you are going with somebody and they get a chance to try different angles, or if they're into doing video and photo as much as you are, they're not going to mind spending a couple extra moments. And worst case scenario, if they're not as into it, then you just kind of hope that there's something that occupies them for a few moments while you do it, or you just say, hey, is it okay if I go snag this video real quick? And most of the time they'll say, yeah, it's no problem. But you just try to be mindful of their time and that the fact that they're there to explore and see things as well. And it's always different with whoever you travel with, because different folks have different priorities. I've traveled with friends where there's absolutely no real hardcore agenda. It's like, yeah, we'll get there when we get there. And then there's others I've traveled with where it's like, all right, we need to go here. We need to be done at this time. We need to go here. We need to be done at this time. We need to go here. We need to be done at this time.
Right.
But it's one of those things, though, where sometimes there's places where you kind of have to go about it that way if you have a lot planned within that particular day.
Yeah.
So there's definitely that aspect of it. And sometimes having somebody else with you can help you kind of keep a better mind, or be a bit better mindful of your time, because of the fact that, you don't want to hold them up the whole time. And so it's like, all right, let me do this a little quicker, or, don't need as many angles, or I don't need to wait for this roller coaster to roll by 20 times just to try and get it over and over again to have multiple shots. I'll just, watch it once or twice, and that should be good.
Yeah, totally get it. I mean, for me, like, I love traveling with my wife. I love traveling with my wife and kids, but I also love taking what I call a mecation, where I kind of just travel somewhere by myself and just kind of do what I want to do. So annually, I started this years ago through work, but I've kind of done it on my own since, is I'll go down to Disney World Universal for Halloween Horror Nights every September by myself, which I absolutely love, because if I want to have nachos or ice cream for lunch, I don't have to convince anybody else. If I want to do the Hard Rock Cafe 4 days in a row, that's great. There's no negotiating. If I want to do the same ride 17 times in a row, totally cool. Or if I'm having a day where I just want to kind of hang in a hotel and watch a movie, I don't have to entertain anybody or convince anybody else. I just like, you know what, I'm going to sit in the hotel and put my iPad on and watch a movie. So, I love it. For me, it helps me to reset myself, I guess. I don't necessarily like it more or less than traveling with my family. Like, I love traveling with my wife, but I do love the occasional mecation, which for me is just a very different experience. And it's funny too, because when I talk to people about it, some people are like, why would you want to travel by yourself? And I'm like, well, why wouldn't I? And like, they're like, I don't know, that feels so weird. I'm like, okay, get over the weird aspect of it. And it's a really different experience. Like, as long as you're comfortable with yourself. For me, I have a great time. I just basically do my own thing. As I said before, have fun with it. And again, it's a Jeff day, basically. Whatever Jeff wants to do, Jeff just does. So to each his or her own, right?
Yeah, exactly. And there's also another aspect to it, that when you do go by yourself, sometimes it encourages you to meet other people a bit more. Not necessarily because, you don't want to seem like you're a loner, but just because you're on your own. So you're more likely to have conversations with people that you might not have if your attention's devoted to somebody else. I think back to that same South Africa trip, and as part of it, because there was a roller coaster that's a bit of an extremely rare one to ride up in the neighboring country of Botswana. I took a day trip up there just so I could try to ride this roller coaster. And it's a park that has a faulty grid system.
Oh, wow.
So the electricity isn't always reliable there. So whether or not this roller coaster was going to run was a question mark for a good chunk of the day. But it ended up working out. However, if it hadn't, I still think about some of the conversations that I had during the course of that day and some of the interactions, because it was like, that was half the experience, was the interactions with people. There was a point when I had gotten the cab ride out to this park, which is on the outskirts of Gaborone, their capital. And as we get to the park, it's like in the middle of a savanna, just kind of by itself. It literally felt like the scenes off of, what's the movie I'm thinking of? For Black Panther, when he goes to the ancestral lands.
Gotcha.
Just without the purple glow. So more like the natural version of what that would look like.
Yep.
So it's like your back is to the park, and out there, it's like the ancestral lands, but without the purple glow. And then you turn around, there's the gate to the park. And it was just such a weird moment to have that thought, especially because I was on my own for that trip. But as I walk up to the gate, there was a bus full of school kids that were there, these Botswanan school children. And I started putting sunscreen on because, I suffer from becoming crustacean with too much sunlight exposure. And a couple of them asked, "What's that?"
Oh, no.
And I said, "It's sunscreen." And they said, "What's sunscreen?" Like they had never heard of it before.
Wow.
And so I had to tell them it's something that helps to keep my skin from burning. And then they followed with, "Can I try it?" And then later on in the park, I ended up meeting a South African family that was from the northern part of South Africa, a little bit more of a remote area. I don't think they were near any major cities. of northern South Africa. And it was mom and dad, grandma and grandpa, and their 2 daughters. And I basically ended up spending most of the day just sitting there having a chat with grandpa and with dad just about, being from the United States and what it was like for them living there in the northern part of South Africa as they were on vacation and camping at this resort. And there's a point where I had a quick chat with one of their 2 daughters, she would have been about 8, 9 years old. And at one point she starts asking, "Why is your accent so weird?" And it was such a weird thing to think about because, living here in the States, nobody really thinks that my accent's weird.
Sure.
They know that it's not a Southern accent or it's not a New Jersey accent. It's kind of this Western Washington accent, which, it's not really a recognized one. But to go into this other country and hear someone say, "Why is your accent so weird?" Like, I'd never had that happen before. And then the last interaction that I had before heading back to the main part of Habarone, I spoke with one of the park staff. I think she was a manager. And we had this conversation about I was trying to get the Botswanan coins because I collect currency from these different countries as I try to get one of each kind of coin and put in a plastic bin that's in my bedroom. And so they helped me with getting the coins of Botswana, which I think their currency is called the Pula.
Okay.
If I remember right. And as they helped me out with getting that, we were having this conversation talking about native cultures. And I started to mention a bit about, how here in Western Washington, we have a lot of recognition about the native tribes of the Pacific Northwest, especially the Coastal Salish people. And then at one point, I realized that I had a spare quarter in my pocket, and I just offered it to her so that she'd have like an American quarter.
Nice.
And she had, the way she reacted, it was almost as if I had just given her like the grandest gift, which I don't know how much of that was her being really kind or if there was a genuine aspect to it.
Sure.
I would like to think it was more genuine just because she seemed like a very genuine person.
Right.
But I also understand that, it was a quarter. So, it wouldn't have surprised me if it wasn't really meant to be like a grand reaction. But it was still such a neat conversation, and as were the other 2. And that's something that I think sometimes you end up missing out on if you're with friends or a group of friends in a different place because you sometimes focus on the conversations with them.
Got it. That's fair. I mean, obviously different experiences by yourself versus with other people. To your point, you're opening yourself up to conversations with other people because you're not, let's say, tied down to other people that you've traveled with. So definitely interesting perspectives. I do appreciate that. We are getting a little bit late in the pod. I did have a couple of questions I did want to ask you about that in our pre-conversation you'd mentioned. So something that intrigues me is, so for myself, like I'm not really a narcissist, but I do love seeing myself on TV or on magazines and stuff like that. You sent over a picture to me, and I'll share this for anybody who's watching this on the video. And this completely just blew my mind. So for anybody watching, here's a picture of Gary on the side of a bus. Can you give us a little backstory on how this happened, why this happened, and kind of like what this is?
Yeah. So as of today, my current day job is as a tour guide in Seattle. I work for a company called Tours Northwest. I started with them back in 2016, about a year after I moved back to Washington. And about a year or 2 into my time there, I get back from a tour, and our training driver, whose name is Brian, he's our head of training, and he tells me, "Hey, stand in front of this whiteboard." So I stand in front of this board that they had attached to the fence outside. And he said, "Now put your arms out." No, like you're presenting something. Rotate, a little higher, click. And then I asked, "What's this for?" It's like, "Oh, you'll find out."
Oh, no.
And then sure enough, I find out that I'm on about 5 or 6 of our buses.
Wow.
And so they took pictures of several of us and have put them on the sides of the buses as, kind of a creative way to showcase Seattle on the bus and show what we're about. And this particular picture in the background is a replication of the view that you would get from Cary Park, which is one of the famous viewing spots in downtown Seattle. Obviously, there's some touches that have been made to it. Mount Rainier would actually be a little bit closer to where my head is,
Okay.
but you would get a view of Mount Rainier in the background like that. And so this has been one of those things where with friends, after I showed them that I was on the side of the bus, folks who I know here locally will say, yeah, I've seen you on the bus. I saw your bus today. And when I'm doing tours, people will see it. And if it's one of the ones that I'm on the side of, they'll say, is this your company? Do you own it? It's like, no, I'm just one of the drivers. I just get to be the showcase driver. And of course, it makes for a great photo because sometimes they'll take a picture of the picture on the bus and I'll stand next to it, like, hey, there it is. And then I think I shared with you the 3 levels of Garyception when I had received one of our Employee of the Month awards. And they had the picture of me holding the certificate in front of that bus. So it was like I was presenting it to myself. And then
give me one moment. I'll put that on the screen for anybody who's watching a video. This also just blows my mind. Like, I just love I think you described it as the multiplicity of it. Like, it's just a fantastic visual, I think. Give me one moment there. There it is.
Yeah, so that's me holding the picture that was going to be posted on the wall where they were putting up the Employee of the Month award pictures. And so I'm holding the certificate that I was just given and making it look like I just presented it to myself. And then, took this picture of holding the picture.
Right.
And I always thought if I really wanted to get hardcore with it, that the next thing I would do would be to take that picture and put it on a mug and then have a picture of me holding the mug while I'm drinking from it, and then take that picture and put it on a t-shirt or something like that. So I could have like multiple layers of it. And then there's times where you'll have 2 of the buses with my picture on it and they'll face one another. And I'll jokingly tell people that it's the middle of a Gary dime.
That's great.
And it's kind of become a bit of a legend with groups of friends of mine, especially in one of my coaster groups. It's a club known as the Buzz Bars Coaster Club.
Okay.
And one of the running jokes is that I should be the driver for everything, and that folks are going to get on the Gary bus. And there was a point where we did a trip to Europe in 2022, and we rented a 9-passenger van. There were 8 of us in it, and I basically was the bus driver for that one.
That's crazy. Do you ever run into people randomly in town, whether it be socially, whether it be just randomly, maybe even on a date or something, and like, you look familiar, but I'm not sure from where, and eventually you kind of bring it back to, oh, right, you're on the side of a bus, something like that?
No, it hasn't happened like that. It hasn't really happened like that because our buses are kind of localized to just the downtown core of Seattle.
Okay.
I've never even had it happen when I've gone to downtown for my own purposes where I'm heading in just to go like to a restaurant there or go see a sporting event, and one of our buses that I happen to be on passes by. The closest that I've had happen to that was with a friend who came to visit back in April. Okay. And we went on a little self-driving tour around Seattle. I showed him some of the different landmarks, and we get to one of the places which is a common stop for our tours. And the bus that was being used for the tour at that time was one that had my picture on it. Nice. So here I am just in street clothes standing in front of it so he can take a picture to send to our common friends. And then sure enough, this guide's passengers are coming back. They're like, wait, that's you. So that's probably the closest that I've had to that.
Because I was going to say, since you do, obviously you work there and you've got some, let's say, some power over where the bus could maybe be at sometimes, like that would be the ultimate move, right? Like, you're out in the town, you've got a blind date, I don't know, whatever it is. And coincidentally, the bus with your face on it just happens to drive by while you're out to dinner or out to drinks. Like that would be the move, right? That would be kind of like, hey, they'd be like, who are you really? Like, why are you inside of a bus? Like that would just be kind of like one of those like, wow modes,
Yeah, I mean that would definitely add a lot of mystique. And then as we start talking more, and they find out that I've gone on these random excursions where I end up taking an overnight bus to the town of Huancayo in Peru, which is a 7-hour bus ride from Lima to go ride this dinky little roller coaster. Then that might be the point where they think something's not quite right there.
Right.
But at least for moments, I get the glory of being on the side of the bus.
I mean, that's amazing. Like, who knows how long it's going to last for? So I definitely would milk it for as long as you can, because how many people could say they were on the side of a bus, right? Like you and
absolutely.
probably hundreds of celebrities, but you're probably not getting paid what they're getting paid. They're probably running the business or they're a spokesperson. So you take it while you can, make the most of it, and just enjoy it, right?
Oh, absolutely. And I always thought it would be funny. I haven't quite gotten to this point, but I keep telling myself I need to get in touch with with one of our office staff to see if I can get a copy of the file of that, so I
Yeah.
can print out like poster size versions of it. And on the days that I have that bus where I'm on the side, I
Yeah.
could give out a free one that's autographed or something like that, just as like a gag gift at the end. Like, one final trivia question before you all go. And then whoever gets it right, he's like, now you get your own autographed poster.
Give it. You got to monetize this. Figure out a way to sell it or something. I'm sure. I mean, make it a trading cards or something. I mean, there's some way to figure. There's something here. I don't know what it is, but there's definitely something you could do with the picture of you inside of the bus. Sell pictures of whatever. I mean, I've been to shows before where you can get a picture with somebody after a show, and they'll figure out a way to kind of like make money off of that. Like, I don't know. There's something here. I don't know what it is, but I'm sure we can get there.
Might be a little bit different since it's not my bus in particular.
True.
And
yeah, but maybe
my
that's your
bus,
story
but
though. Maybe so. When I went to Rutgers like 100 years ago, I did a couple of tours for prospective freshmen who were considering going to Rutgers. I just made up the goofiest character you could think of. I mean, 19-year-old me on the bus giving the tour. I was saying the dumbest, stupidest thing you could think of, right? Because this is just what you do when you're 19. I'm sure if you do enough tours, you could probably figure out kind of a backstory of how the Taylors own this, or how you're the king of something, or there's some way to do it, right? Because again, not everybody gets their picture on the side of a bus. There's got to be some way to connect it. I don't know, maybe not.
I admire though the fact that you included goofiness into your tours, because that is my tour in a nutshell. And my dry humor sometimes comes through in some of the videos with Coasting with Culture, but it really shines on the tours because I will just have the driest of jokes.
Yeah.
Especially when we get toward the end of our city tour and we're going down Queen Anne Avenue, which is one of the bigger hills in Seattle, on the way back down toward the Space Needle. I'll talk about how we've had ice storms where people will go out in their cars and they go around the corner and they realize it's too late after they're already going down the hill. And
oh no,
as they're sliding down the hill, they hit one car. And then suddenly you got 2 cars going down the hill, and then you got 3 cars going down the hill because it hit another car, and you got 4 cars going down the hill. So it becomes a bit of a car avalanche, or what I like to call carnage.
Whoa, that's good. That's good. Yeah, I mean, you're obviously talking to some paid customers. I was talking to a bunch of probably 16, 17-year-olds who don't know what the rest of their life's going to look like with their parents. So there's a lot of stress. There's a lot of animosity. I tried to kind of, break it a little bit, but 19-year-old me probably went a little too far sometimes, but it's probably a reason why I only did it once or twice. But if the video ever existed, if this happened today, there'd definitely be video of it. We're talking back in the late 90s where everyone didn't have a video camera on them at all times. So different era, I guess you can say.
Yeah.
With that said, Gary, this has been amazing. Really learned a lot about you. So thank you so much for your time. Is there anything you'd like to promote or plug before we scoot out for the day?
Yeah, I've enjoyed coming on here and having a chance to chat with you about travel and being on the side of a bus and Disney. So again, the channel is called Coasting with Culture. It's youtube.com/Coasting with Culture, or you can just search Coasting with Culture on there. And then social media, there's Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter or X, whatever it's called, at Coast W Culture. So I use those social media channels usually to give updates on the progress of videos I'm working on, or kind of live recaps of trips as they happen. And then the YouTube channels where we get more into like the story of what happened in a particular trip, give more details. Some of the videos that I've done in the past have included culture guides where it's, we talk a little bit about a given park and then talk about things you could do while visiting that park in the nearby area. There's also some Just the Coaster videos where it's literally just showing what a particular roller coaster is like. But the meat and potatoes of the Coasting with Culture channel are the travel vlogs, which is to showcase these different experiences and the parks in different parts of the world, as well as the different experiences that go along the way. Because I have definitely learned that if you have something that you really enjoy that can take you to different places, it can be an incredible way to find out new experience, or to find new experiences and learn more about different places as you travel to those different destinations.
Awesome. Well, Gary, thank you again for sharing. For everybody who's listening, once again, I want to thank you so much for joining. Again, all the feedback I've gotten so far really means a lot to me. Definitely trying to learn on this journey. We're only about a month or so in, but definitely feel like I've grown by leaps and bounds personally and professionally since I started this podcast. So thank you all so much. We do have a lot of additional fun guests coming up over the next few weeks. So continue to stand by, hang out, listen, follow me on all of these social media platforms, all the different podcast platforms you listen to when it comes up. Again, we're on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, iHeartRadio, Amazon, CastBox. Still trying to figure out what Good Pods is, but we are there apparently. Reminder, we're on Instagram at Everybody Has a Story Pod. DMs are open. Reach out with questions if you want to be a guest. Totally cool with it. Just want to talk and network here a little bit. My personal Instagram is Seltzer77. For everything Jeff Seltzer, go to jeffseltzer.com. Email us at everybodyhasastorypod@gmail.com. Recently got an email from somebody who said that we are number 105 in leisure podcasts on Apple. I have not been able to double check that, so I'm not sure if that's even true. Apple doesn't seem to acknowledge that, but it's still a cool fact. So if you want to call me Mr. 105, it's not really a brag because it's 105, but it's just a kind of a cool stat. So who knows, whatever. Anyhow, thank you all so much for joining. Have a great week, and I will talk to you again next week. Later.